that occur to food once it enters the GI tract. The first is mechanical breakdown, in which food is physically shredded and torn apart into smaller pieces. This occurs in the mouth, the stomach, and the small intestine. Next, once food is small enough, chemicals can access this to further the breakdown. This is called chemical digestion. Although chemical digestion starts in the mouth, continues in the stomach, the main place where food is broken down chemically is the small intestine. Once food is broken down small enough, it's now able to move across the lining of the intestine and then either into blood vessels or into the lymphatic system. This is a process called absorption. So one way we can define absorption is that it is the movement of food particles from the intestines to either the blood or the lymphatic system. Now remember, these particles must be small enough so they can actually pass the plasma membrane of a cell. Substances that are lipids will move across the small intestine into the lymphatic system. They will be carried back through a series of vessels and ducts into the venous system. But all other types of food compounds are going to move directly into the blood, and this is something called absorption. So how much absorption actually occurs of food and drink? Well, on average, most people ingest about 10 liters of food and drink per day. 10 liters. Think about this. Of that 10 liters, only 1 liter actually reaches the large intestines. So remember that once material enters the large intestine, for the most part, it is waste. So one way to look at this is that about 9 liters of material that you ingest every day is absorbed. That's a lot. So where does absorption occur? Well, we'll go back to the beginning of the GI tract and start with the mouth, where food enters. In terms of absorption here, there's pretty much none. The only exception, perhaps, would be some drugs. And if I get to give you an example of that, would be nitroglycerin. So nitroglycerin is a chemical that is used in people who are having a heart attack. And it is put under the tongue, and it's absorbed very rapidly through the blood vessels into the blood vessels in the mouth. Other than that, no absorption in the mouth, and that makes sense because no food really has been broken down to its building blocks, small enough to be absorbed. Next, the food passes to the pharynx and the larynx. Well, there's no absorption occurring here either. And then finally, it moves to the stomach. Now, remember, in the stomach, the only food group that begins to be broken down is protein. But the protein isn't really broken down into amino acids. It's not small enough to be absorbed. So we could say that in the stomach, there is virtually no absorption of food groups. Probably the only things that are absorbed might include things like alcohol. So some alcohol is absorbed in the stomach. The vast majority is absorbed in the small intestine, but some in the stomach. And some drugs, for example, aspirin, is absorbed in the stomach. So let's continue on. After the small intestine, after the stomach, we reach the small intestine. What's absorbed here? Well, as you might guess, most substances. So just about everything is absorbed here. For example, 95% of water is absorbed in the small intestine. Now remember, for particles or chemicals to move across the plasma membrane, you need energy. The only types of substances don't need energy are fats or lipids, which easily pass the membrane. So for most substances, you need energy, and this process requires, of course, active transport. So remember, in active transport, you need ATP. As we move from the small intestine now, as most substances have been absorbed, there really isn't much left to be absorbed in the large intestine. And so that all that you really see absorbed here is perhaps some water and a few vitamins, which I'll mention in a minute. These vitamins are B12 and vitamin K. And these tend to be absorbed to lymphatic vessels. So since we're talking about absorption, let's take a look at what happens to most food which is absorbed through the small intestine. So these particles are small enough, and of course what you want to happen is these nutritious particles to be circulated through the circulation to all the tissues of the body. And you might assume that once it's absorbed into the veins, it travels back to the heart and it's distributed. But this isn't exactly true. And this brings us to something called the first pass effect of the liver. What happens is, if in the first pass effect, is that after blood is absorbed from the small intestine, instead of traveling back to the heart where it's distributed to all the tissues of the body, it takes a little side trip to the liver first. So let's look at this pathway before we get into the why of this. From the small intestine, most food particles, which are non-lipid, are going to enter the superior mesenteric vein. And from there, they're going to travel to the hepatic portal vein. From the hepatic portal vein, they then go to the liver. And there are several things that are going to happen to these particles once they enter the liver. Once the liver has finished the processes on these particles, they pass back out of the liver through the hepatic vein. And from here to the inferior vena cava, and eventually back to the right atrium of the heart. So again, this is called the first pass effect. And the question is, why does this happen? Why don't food particles travel right back to the heart, where they're immediately distributed? Well, one of the reasons is that the liver itself is a reservoir or a holding tank for some of the chemicals that you absorb from food. So in other words, it acts as a storage unit. And so what the liver does when it gets this nutrient-rich blood is that it removes some of the vitamins and other nutrients for storage. And it stores them until you need them. So think about you're storing a little bit of extra nutrients and vitamins for a rainy day. The other equally, if not more important role of the liver is that it detoxifies chemicals that are in your food. So there are a number of both man-made and natural chemicals found in the food we eat. In most freshwater fish, there are something called PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, and mercury, and a number of pesticides and toxic metals. In many of the plants that we eat, there are residues of pesticides. So in addition, there are a number of microbial compounds, microbial organisms and their toxins. So you don't want those toxins to be spread to all the tissues of your body. So the food particles, after they're absorbed in the small intestine, are going to travel to your liver, where they are detoxified to the best of the liver's ability, and then they are then returned to the venous system to be distributed to the tissues of your body. The liver has a number of enzyme systems that are very specific in detoxifying particular chemicals. And this is a very important role of the liver. So on this slide, I've listed some of the roles, and some of them we've just mentioned, although this is listed in a little more detail. So for example, the liver processes blood-borne nutrients. We already mentioned that. And they include things like amino acids, which are the breakdown products of proteins, fats, and carbs, the breakdown products of carbohydrates. It also stores valuable vitamins. They tend to be fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, vitamin K, and B12. The liver also stores iron, the symbol being Fe. Iron is a component of red blood cells, because one of the things the liver does, besides these things listed here, is it breaks down old red blood cells. And you might remember this from the chapter on blood. It breaks down old red blood cells into their building blocks, and it will store the iron for use at a later date. It detoxifies harmful chemicals and drugs. Some other things we didn't mention is it actually produces glucose in the process of gluconeogenesis. We've talked about this before. It stores it. It also produces bile, which I'm going to mention in a minute, and also regulates the levels of fatty acids, lipids, and cholesterol. So if we take a look here, this is an anterior view of the liver. And you can see the liver is made of 4 lobes in a human. You might remember this from the lab. The left lobe of the liver, the larger right lobe here, and then we have what's called the quadrate lobe, and finally the caudate lobe up here. You'll notice the gallbladder, which is where the bile is stored and concentrated. Okay, I will end this chapter just mentioning colorectal cancer, since a lot of you are going to go into the health field. The reason this is an issue is that colon cancer is the second largest cause of cancer death in males, the number one cause being lung cancer. It is actually the third largest cause of death in females. Third largest. And of course, this is a cancer of the colon, which includes the ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid colon. Now, why is it a big deal? Well, one problem is that colon cancers rarely have early warning signs, very rarely. And unfortunately, by the time they're found, they may already have metastasized. Often what happens first is you see these little polyps, which means a finger-like projection. This polyp is forming on the mucosa. And the incidence of polyps increases with age. These polyps are benign, which means that they have not moved or metastasized. What can happen next is the polyps, you can start to, not the polyps, but you can start to form actually colon cancers which will metastasize. Metastasize means that they will move. They will move through the bloodstream, the lymphatic system, and they will land in another tissue and start growing there. And that's a trait that only occurs in cancer or transformed cells. This is not a trait of normal healthy cells. Well, if you think about the colon, you might think, well, we could do without our colon. It doesn't do a whole lot. Why does this kill people? One of the reasons is that one of the major places it metastasizes to is the liver. And the liver is really something you can't do without. So, this is one of the cancers that is highly preventable. In fact, people whose cancer is found early on have a 90% chance of survival at 5 years. That's a very good survival rate for people with cancer. What is recommended in the health field is that at a certain age, usually around the age of 50, if people are healthy, they should have regular colon exams. And so if the colon is viewed, you can see if there are polyps or the beginnings of cancer. Also, regular dental and medical exams. So in this final slide, I'll just show you a picture. This is a part of the large intestine, and you can see that there are 2 polyps here. Here's one here. Here's a smaller one. And here you have cancer, invasive